So that's what I'm going to take it towards the very end. So network theory started about 10 years ago. And I'm going to show you the paper that really started it. But before network theory came about, there was no real way to analyze data sets such as this. There just weren't tools for it. You could extract these networks, and really before computers became very powerful, you couldn't even build these networks because there was too much data. But what happened 10 years ago was a very important paper by Watson-Strogatz was published, where they characterized what they called small world networks. And there's two variables that they really cared about and looked at. And one is called clustering coefficient. There's another metric called local efficiency that's very similar. I'm not going to go into it, but it's just another metric of clustering. Clustering is simply the probability that your friends, or a node's connections, are also connected to each other. So in this example, you're red. You have your 5 friends there. You just calculate the proportion of links between your friends divided by the total number of possible links between your friends, and that's the clustering coefficient. It just says, are people who talk to each other also talking to each other? Okay? Very simple idea. And the important thing about clustering coefficient is we knew a long time ago that real networks were clustered. Just no one had figured out a good way to quantitatively assess this, and I'll show you what I mean in a minute. The other metric is called path length. This is the distance from one node to another, the shortest distance you can get. So in this little cartoon here, a very small graph, going from the node with the red arrow, you see the distance to every other node. And you calculate the shortest distance to get from each node to each node, okay? This cartoon, it's very simple. You can imagine calculating the shortest paths on this network, right? The number of possibilities to go from one place to another is tremendous. It becomes a computational challenge. But there are some algorithms available out there, thanks to mostly computer scientists, that allow this to be a calculable thing. So what do path length and clustering have to do with small worlds? Well, Watson-Strogatz, actually, they were studying, of all things, crickets and fireflies. They wanted to know what made them synchronize. They wanted to know why is it crickets can synchronize, and they started thinking about what it is about communication between interconnected systems. And so most people prior to them had studied random graphs. There's a famous mathematician named Erdos, if you've heard of him, and he studied random graphs his whole life. And the problem with random graphs is they're not realistic. So if I say, okay, well, everyone in this room has 100 friends, and they have 100 friends, and they have 100 friends, you only have to go out about 5 steps, and you cover all the population of the world. But the reality is your 100 friends are probably overlapping with your friend's 100 friends. They're not all independent, right? There's some overlap between those people, and that's what relates to clustering. And so if you look on the left-hand side of this, that's a regular lattice. It's just shown in a circle, but you could put it out as a flat lattice. The point is here that any one node is connected to other nodes, but those nodes are also talking to each other. So this node is connected to this node, right? And this node is connected to this node. Well, these two nodes are connected as well. They're clustered. There's a high clustering in a lattice. Most nodes that talk to each other are in a cluster. Not only because it's connected, but there's high clustering. But on the other hand, path length is really long. If you want to get from one side, I can't ever get the mouse, from here to here, you have to gradually step all the way across this network. If this network were, the stadium of a soccer game, you could imagine how long it would take to get a signal from one side to the other. So regular lattices have high clustering, but they have really high path lengths. And everyone's like, well, that doesn't fit this small world idea that if things are tightly connected, this doesn't work. Random networks, on the other hand, have very short path lengths. You can get from anywhere to anywhere. It's a very short number of steps in even a very large random network. But they have virtually no clustering. And so when Erdos was studying these, though he developed a lot of mathematical tools to study them, he didn't capture many people's interest because they're not realistic. No one's network that people were studying networks wanted to apply his tools, but they didn't capture any clustering. And they're like, well, our networks are clustered. And he's like, well, I can't do that. So in 1998, Watson-Strogatz started to look at this problem. And they thought about it, and they said, what if we take our regular lattice and simply randomly rewire some of the connections with some probability from 0 to 1. All right? Well, and that's what this figure is. And they called this a small world network. Now, what was critical that they wanted to see is there some point in this random rewiring where we can capture a network that has high clustering like a lattice, but low path lengths like a random network. And in fact, that's why they published their paper. It turns out, to give you a sense how important this paper is, just the other day I searched it.
I think I just lost them.
Will they pop back up, or do we have to do something?
I don't know. 50-50 shot. Actually, I have that sticky under the computer.
They're back.
Okay.
Our path length to you is 1 unless the computer goes out. Let's see. So this paper, which was published 10 years ago, I checked the other day, has been cited 4,200 times. Okay, to give you a sense of that, I have a decent publication record. I have about almost 50 publications. My total cites on all 50 of my publications is 1,200. So this paper is like 4 times better than all the work I've done so far in my career. Okay, it's a tremendous number of citations for 10 years. And most of it is in physics and social sciences, very little in biology. It's just now starting to get picked up in biology. But here's what they found. So this graph shows on the y-axis normalized scale for path length and clustering. Clustering is the squares, path length is the circles. Okay? The x-axis is the probability from this figure, the probability of rewiring. So at 0 probability, it's a perfect lattice. At probability of 1, it's a perfectly random network. And so what you see here is at probability of 1, path length is really low, but there's almost no clustering, right? At probability of 1, path length's really high, clustering's really high. What they found that's so important is the area in between. It's this, I forget, they can't see me pointing. It's this region in between. Because as they began rewiring, path length dropped off precipitously. But clustering stayed relatively high until some point. So it's this region in here that they called small world networks. These networks have an extraordinary power that no one had described or modeled before. A network with small world characteristics can exhibit distributed processing and regional specificity. So before this, no network could do that. What does that mean? Take the brain, for example. That's what I study. The brain, we know, has all these different regions. Visual cortex in the back. The auditory cortex for sound is on the side. Frontal lobe is for high order cognition. That's regional specificity. Everyone believes that. Everyone's described it for hundreds of years. There's certain parts of the brain that perform certain functions. But no one could explain how is it that the brain could have regional specificity, yet everyone claims it uses distributed processing. It was until this model came out could you actually build a network that could capture both processes. And it's really important. I list on here some of the networks that have been shown since to exhibit small world properties. And so far, to my knowledge, any self-organized network. So self-organized means it wasn't pre-engineered. Someone didn't draw a plan and make it. So the internet is actually self-organized, right? That started out with 2 computers, one in San Francisco and one in LA, I think. And people just started adding computers. It wasn't like, oh, we're going to design the internet. The power grid of the United States is actually self-organized. They built power stations where the people moved. They didn't just say, well, let's lay out this grid of power. Wherever people moved, they built a new power